Good morning. The topic, as you can see from the program for this panel, is there progress in financial regulation? I think that in many circles there's a general agreement that a complete breakdown in regulation was a major part of the problem we had. I don't think that is a unanimous opinion, however, and I think one of the questioners, of Mr. Ballard, I may have misunderstood him, and if so, I just take this as a reference to something else, seemed to want to argue that regulation was a major part of the problem because it was bad regulation in a positive way, if you will, that this, I think, is the Fannie and Freddie thesis that somehow they caused all of our problems by forcing banks to make loans to people who couldn't repay them. I don't think that is accurate. There was many problems we had. Fannie and Freddie were part of it, but I don't think a particularly large part of it. Banks were thinly capitalized. They played games with their capitalization. One thing I very much remember is being assured by bank regulators as we entered this crisis that the banks were well capitalized, so I didn't need to worry about them. And at the same time, we all knew they had found various ways to play games with the capitalization rules, and we somehow thought those games didn't matter in the end. Then of course, we had the references you heard earlier to things like ninja loans, a system whereby the person making the loan doesn't think he has any reason to care if it's repaid, which I'd love to hear some psychologist examining. In any case, we did pass Dodd-Frank, as you heard. We're spending a lot of time passing rules on it now. I hope some of our speakers will talk a little bit about how that's going. Some of it is going poorly, and part of that is for the reasons. The Volcker Rule, I think, is a classic. The Volcker Rule says they shall not engage in speculative trading, but it is okay to make markets and it is okay to hedge. I grew up going to Sunday school every week. I suspect that Jesus could have figured out the difference between the two. I'm not sure anyone else could. In any case, we're going to have three speakers. They'll speak briefly. I'm going to ask questions and comments to be held until all have spoken, and then we'll have, I hope, a conversation for a little while. The first speaker is Bob Barbera, who's co-director of the Center for Financial Economics at Johns Hopkins and a longtime economist on Wall Street. Thank you.
Thank you, Floyd. Well, today's seminar actually has a fantastic concept, at least as I read through it. As the organizers put it, it is time to put global finance back in its proper place as an agent for achieving sustainable development. Well, finance as an agent for sustainable development certainly is a wonderful notion. I found a little odd, though, the phrase putting finance back in its proper place. That implies that there was some period earlier in the world's history when finance was an agent for sustainable development, and I must have missed that period. Or certainly during my professional life, finance, although it delivers the goods in the short and intermediate term, has always played an essential role in the destabilizing dynamic that is the boom and bust cycle. In fact, Hyman Minsky, certainly his whole framework was on the destabilizing nature of finance in a capitalist economy. Minsky didn't pull any punches on what he thought was the remedy, and he felt that what we needed to do was to socialize investment, so that if the government's in charge of the investment, the boom and bust cycle goes away because they're going to do it in a more prudent and a less swing of sentiment basis. Now, many Minsky enthusiasts embrace that, but some of us don't. Okay, some of us, in fact, loved his diagnosis, but stopped short of embracing his prescriptions. And so you're then left with a question. If you think he had the diagnosis right, but you certainly want no part of socializing investment, how do you proceed? More specifically, how do you proceed with regulation, and how do you proceed with monetary policy? Why not embrace his approach? Well, in French, we say ne pas jeter le bébé avec l'eau de bain. Okay, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. More specifically, it is, somebody like Schumpeter would tell you this, but Nicholas Caldor would tell you as well that it is the economy where people have a certain recklessness and enthusiasm for taking risks that over the long term delivers the higher trajectory for growth. Okay, and in addition, one of the speakers here, Mr. Veneroso, when we were in Berlin in December, regaled us with extraordinary descriptions of China's investment strategies over the last 5 years and how they're destined to go up into oblivion. As a consequence, it does appear that public sector investment can put you in the soup as well. Although I'm waiting for the soup to arrive, Frank. So if the government can get you into trouble, and if private sector enthusiasm is an important part of a dynamic economy, how do we strike that balance between regulation and monetary policy? The standard split suggests the following. Monetary policy is in charge, as you've all learned, right? Woodford told us, monetary policy is in charge solely of stable prices. What we discovered in 2008, some of us had discovered it in 1999, but what we discovered in 2008 is you can have big destabilization in the overall economy due to finance, notwithstanding the fact that wages and prices didn't do much. And so we then talk about macroprudential regulations. Okay, we'll have the regulatory architecture deal with the financial destabilizing dynamic, and we'll have monetary policy focus on wages and prices. Okay, I think that's painfully inadequate. I think monetary policy should be playing a central role in the issue of financial system dynamics. I was amazed we didn't come to that in the aftermath of the tech wreck. But the fact that we're still here debating it now is based on the dynamics we've seen around the globe, pretty astounding. How might we think about regulation and how might we think about monetary policy? Why don't we bring two personalities into play for a moment. On regulation, Jamie Dimon, and on monetary policy, Jean-Claude Trichet. Okay, Jamie Dimon says that Dodd-Frank is costing him enormously, that you've got hundreds of lawyers who are doing nothing other than trying to figure it out. It's driving him crazy. It's adversely affecting his return on equity, and he's being prevented from delivering the kind of returns that his investors had become used to. Now, say what you will about whether or not it's macro-prudential, you can't take issue with what he's saying in terms of the costs to him. Okay, you can listen to small banks who say they're not competitive because it's so complex and you've got to hire so many lawyers. All right? My response to Jamie would be that he's absolutely right, that deadweight loss is an unambiguous problem with something as large and as cumbersome as Dodd-Frank. 20% Tier 1 capital. So you're not going to get that return on equity. You're not going to get anything like that return on equity. Your shareholders are going to be angry with you, but we're going to get you from here to there with one sweeping change. Think about what Minsky said. Minsky said one of the keys was having cash on hand if things go bad. 20% Tier 1 capital, where we don't talk about risk-based capital because we never know what's risky, right? You know, well, what could be safer than mortgages? Well, what could be safer than sovereign debt, like Italian debt? So it's 20% Tier 1 capital. You've got to really have some cash on hand. You don't get to determine what kind of risks you're taking. And then you could get by with, I think, substantially less micromanaging on the regulatory side. You can make the case that micromanaging on the regulatory side is sort of a backdoor way to getting the government into the decision-making about investing. Okay, impose those kinds of restraints in terms of Tier 1 capital and accept the fact that in the end, excesses will be there. Which then leads me to the second point, and actually following President Bullard is particularly delicious in that regard. Jean-Claude Trichet. Jean-Claude Trichet made the point time and again in his tenure at the ECB that there was one needle in the compass, right? One needle in the compass. The central bank should be worried about one thing and one thing alone, and that is inflation. And he loved to tell you that his record on inflation was spectacular, better than the Bundesbank over any 10-year period. I apologize for the few of you who are with me in Berlin, but I will recount a story. My dad lives in Europe 6 months out of the year. My dad's 92, and somehow I do think this relates to Jean-Claude Trichet. My dad spent about 4 months in the hospital last year. He had a very difficult time. He kept having these sharp declines in blood pressure, big declines. Finally, in talking with his doctor asked him, had he been doing anything differently? And he said, yes, he'd been, about 6 months earlier, began to take pills from his kidney doctor. His kidney doctor said his kidney was looking a little shaky, so he should take these pills. And he told the doctor what they were, and the doctor said, oh my God, that's absurd. With your heart condition, taking those pills, one of the obvious side effects is that you have a sharp decline in blood pressure. My dad then called the renal doctor, and the doctor said, look, you've been my patient for 30 years, your kidney's in great shape. As far as I'm concerned, take these pills, it'll keep your kidney in great shape. And so my dad said to me, he said, well, I came to understand what the doctor was saying to me. He doesn't care if I die. He just wants to make sure that when I die, my kidney looks pretty good. Which was Jean-Claude Trichet's approach to Europe during his tenure. Okay? Wage and price inflation was going to look pretty good, and despite the fact that the patient was dying, he felt he had been doing his job. Okay, so how do we define then monetary policy, tie it into the issue of regulatory decisions and financial system excesses? Go back to first principles. Why did we form central banks? Initially, central banks were formed, not the ECB, which was poorly formed, but the Bank of England, the US Fed. It was all about panics in the banking system. So your initial role was banking system panics. It evolved to a singular focus on wage and price inflation. Why? Because in the 1960s and 1970s, that was the destabilizing dynamic. So you said, I'm in the business of delivering stability, because I think long run, a more stable system gives you a higher trajectory for growth. Right now, the destabilizing event is on the wage and price side. Since the mid-1980s, that simply hasn't been the case, right? We had an extraordinary dynamic in the S&L industry in the US. Very small inflation. The inflation went away. The S&L dynamic was still suffering. We had headwinds. The economy didn't do well. You had small inflation. The Bank of Japan tightened. Their asset bubble burst, and they still are struggling to get out of it. You had the Asian contagion in the mid-90s. You had the tech wreck. And of course, most recently and spectacularly, we had the dynamic that went on in the housing market and all of the ensuing disappointing economic growth globally. So since the mid-1980s, the destabilizing dynamic is in the asset market. The central banks are supposed to reflect upon that, not pretend that they can define their job so that they make sure our kidney is okay and not worry about the overall health of the patient. Really quickly, some counterfactual notions about how this might work. Think about the last cycle in the US, okay? Professor Taylor tells us if they simply followed the Taylor rule, we would have done better. Well, I don't buy that at all. He's using headline inflation, and that would have required the Fed to be tightening in 2002 and 2003 amidst extraordinary declines in financial markets, incredible backing away of risk appetites, and you could have easily double-dipped if you had tightened when the headline CPI told you to do so, right? Conversely, if you had been watching asset markets, watch the spread between BAA bonds and the 10-year Treasury, when things turned around in 2004 with a vengeance and spreads became very tight, and you knew that the financial system was awash with enthusiasm and excess, you could have been tightening more aggressively. Would you have prevented the housing bubble? No. But if the funds rate went up a lot faster over that period, and you burst the bubble 1 year earlier, what would that have delivered you? Okay, well, it was exponential. right? I mean, the last 6 months were the crazy, liar loans with no money down and you own 20 houses and you didn't leave a forwarding address. Okay, so eliminate that last year of excess and it would have been impressive. The flip side right now, if you're in the business then of caring about asset markets, caring about risk appetites, and trying to restart enthusiasm in a stronger economy, that leads you to an enthusiasm for the QE that we've been getting from the Fed, and it leads you to believe that the ECB is still very much behind. Anyone who looks at the performance for the European economy versus the US economy over the last 3 years, I think would have to argue that at least behind closed doors, these things are being taken into account. That's why we've got aggressive forward guidance and aggressive QE. We want risk appetites to rise. We want spreads to come in to restart the economy and do somewhat better. That is not a singular focus on inflation, and I think it's not a focus on how regulations can deliver us that dynamic, but instead on monetary policy. Thank you.
The next speaker is José Antonio Ocampo from Colombia.
Well, let me start by thanking Dimitri, Jan, and Leonardo for the invitation to be with you today. I'm going to ask to talk about one particular aspect of regulation, which is not much discussed in the United States, but which is central for emerging economies, which is cross-border regulation. So regulation of cross-border capital flows. This is, of course, a central issue, actually, not only for emerging economies. We have seen in Europe the cost of unregulated cross-border capital flows, which is still exploding in different manners. I mean, the dynamics of several peripheral European countries is not very different from what we have seen in the past in emerging economies. It's a boom in financing across borders, which generates asset bubbles of different character. They also generate large current account deficits, which at the end turn out to be unsustainable and lead to adjustment of the economies. And this, of course, has been at the center of lots of analysis. I would say, including the IMF, which in its World Economic Outlook of a year and a half ago had an excellent analysis of capital flows, which it indicated that capital flows are volatile, in fact, are increasingly volatile. Their volatility is stronger for emerging economies, but for developed economies. And that the traditional differences between different capital flows in terms of volatility are narrowing down. In particular, that foreign direct investment, which was seen traditionally as a very more stable source of finance, is increasingly volatile. And the argument is because it is also subject to financialization in different forms. So this cross-border finance is an essential issue of finance. So it's the most surprising is when the the G20 gave this mandate to the Financial Stability Board to look at after financial regulation. It totally forgot about this particular issue. So cross-border finance was not included at all in the agenda. In fact, it's almost as saying that cross-border finance is not finance, or it doesn't have the same problems that other traditional forms of finance. Now, actually, the G20 did undertake this issue as part of the discussions actually led by Brazil in 2011. So in the Cannes meeting, there was actually a little appendix, let's say, on this issue that actually is one of the best documents on the topic. Now, the discussion on cross-border finance was taken on board by the IMF, So it is there that there has been a debate on this issue after the global financial crisis. And it has been actually interesting to follow both IMF research. Internal controversies are actually one of the good things about the reforms that have been taking place in the IMF in recent years, is that finally outsiders can look at the discussions within the IMF among staff members, different views. This is something that, those of us who look at the World Bank and other financial institutions knew about, that, they are not, homogeneous views, but in the IMF, it gave the impression that there was almost homogeneous views on different subjects. So we finally found that there are different views within the IMF on this issue, which I think is actually healthy for the debate. And of course, everyone knew about the different views among board members in the IMF on this particular topic. So this led to the two sort of decisions, one in 2010, which came out to be quite controversial. And so the issue was further discussed, and in November last year, the board discussed this, what came to be known as the institutional view of the IMF on capital flows and capital account liberalization. Now, of course, there was no total consensus, and actually the director for Brazil objected, let's say, to the institutional view. And there are also mixed views, let's say, among other board members. Now, nonetheless, I consider that this was a significant advance in the conception of the issue. And let me try to summarize for those of you who are not familiar with this, what it has and what advantages and disadvantages it has. First, it accepted the view that many of us had expressed for a long time, that and the IMF in some documents also has in the past, that capital flows carry risk, and that therefore, under certain conditions, they should be regulated. They call them capital flow management techniques of different character, which they consider should be part of the macroprudential toolkit for countries. I must say that the concept of macroprudential had been in the air, let's say, in the discussion for a long time. At least, I had written about this also long before the crisis. It was also part, and particularly, of the language of the Bank of International Settlements, but it had not been adopted, let's say, as a mainstream view until the recent crisis. Now, the idea is that, boom-bust cycles have to have imply that risk are of a macroeconomic character, a thing that we widely knew in emerging economies, and that, therefore, it has to be a concern of macroeconomic policy and not only regulatory policy. So I think that's the origin of this concept of macroprudential, which I think has been one of the advances during the recent crisis, at least in ideas, less so probably in terms of actions. Now, the concepts, by the way, I actually appreciate the fact that the IMF itself used the terms capital flow management rather than capital control, because of course the term capital control by itself carry a negative meaning. So for this reason, I have always, for a long time, writing about this, have called them capital account regulations. They should be considered part of the regulatory toolkit, not something abnormal. Regulatory toolkits have quantitative restrictions, for example, prohibitions of different characters. They have price-based systems, incentives to do things, for example, capital requirements, or liquidity requirements. So they have the same thing. So if you call them, the prohibitions controls, they should be called like that, But generally you call the whole family regulations, right? So the same thing with capital account. You have to have regulations of different character. Now, in the advantage then is this recognition that regulations make sense for the capital account under certain conditions. However, the IMF tends to view these regulations as sort of what I call last resort interventions. So essentially, you have to do everything else. Let the adopt countercyclical monetary and fiscal policies. Let your exchange rate appreciate when you have a capital account boom, accumulate reserves, and then if you are desperate, please use capital account regulations. It's a caricature, but it's not too far from the conception that they have put on the table. Now, I think the basic problem with this view is the fact that for emerging economies, or generally for all economies that are subject to pro-cyclical capital flows, the policy space or the degrees of freedom to adopt counter-cyclical monetary policies is significantly restricted by the volatility or the procyclicality of capital flows. So unless you incorporate in the design of the whole package some sort of regulation of capital flow, you may not be able to do counter-cyclical policies. And this is particularly because taking monetary policy, you adopt a counter-cyclical monetary policy, that means that you have to increase interest rate when there is a booming capital inflow. But by increasing the interest rate, you actually attract more capital, right? So you're actually doing a pro-cyclical policy from that point of view. Then, of course, they said, oh, no, let the exchange rate absorb the shock. So the exchange rates absorb the shock, and that has, first of all, pro-cyclical effect, because you can argue that in economies that have net liabilities in foreign currency, actually appreciation generates a capital gain, which is pro-cyclical. And I think it's a major effect of that we know very well in emerging economies. But further than that, that generates an increase in the current account deficit, which everyone knows, according to the extensive literature, is a source of, or generates a risk of crisis. So it's unclear whether you should exchange rate appreciate very much. Okay, accumulate reserves. Yes, accumulate reserves, but accumulation of reserves is very costly. In fact, the accumulation of reserves by emerging economies, I would describe in very simplistic terms as essentially intermediating between private capital markets and the US Treasury, right? Because they basically absorb the excess of capital flows from private markets, and they accumulate reserves which are invested in the US Treasuries and at extremely low interest rate. That's essentially what that is. So it's not always it's a particular instrument, but so you have to mix, in a sense, a set of instruments that are all insufficient to try to do a countercyclical policy to manage, the booming capital inflow, and that includes, in my view, essentially some form of regulation of capital inflows. Again, when you are facing procyclical flows. Then there are two other elements before I go into my last point. There are two other elements which I find particularly important and positive in the position that adopted by the IMF. The first one is the recognition that this view that capital accounts should be under certain conditions subject to regulation, should be taken into account in other agreements. And this is very important because there are many agreements that actually forbid the use of capital account regulations, including all free trade agreements with the United States in particular, but also OECD agreements and several investment agreements. So, it's a positive sign. And second, and this will lead to my last point, that source countries should be conscious of the externality they generate through this means. This leads me to the way the global imbalances are taking place now. So after the financial crisis, what have we seen in terms of global imbalances? We have seen essentially a reduction in the U.S. Deficit, so which I think is a welcome development. And at the same time, what you see is Europe turning from a slightly deficit to a surplus position in the current accounts, which is totally unnecessary from the point of view of the world. It's one of the reflections of the absence of adequately expansionary monetary and fiscal policies in the euro area in particular. But that's, that's another pressure. So those are two big pressures for the world economy to, in the direction of surplus, let's say. And there is a third, which is, of course, the oil exporting countries, which are now, again, running massive surpluses. So it just happens there has to be someone on the other side, right, accumulating deficits. And when you see what is happening in terms of deficits, there are two things happening. First of all, China is reducing its surplus. That's a positive phenomenon. But then non-oil emerging economies are being forced to accumulate increasing deficits. And I said that's one of the essential features of the way global imbalances are taking place today. And I think this is so the expression that came from the Brazil first, the capital tsunami, as the president of Brazil mentioned, or the currency wars, as the finance minister of Brazil mentioned, now has been echoed actually by the more orthodox finance and central bank governors of Latin America. The same idea is being echoed now by the Chilean finance minister, the Colombian finance minister, by the Mexican central bank governor, pointing out exactly that. Now, which leads me to the interesting question: what should we do about this? The position of some of these people is, well, tell the U.S. not to run an expansionary monetary policy, or Europe or Japan. I actually think that's a wrong prescription. The U.S., Japan, and Europe should have an expansionary monetary policy. I think that's part of what the world economy requires today. But then how do we stop that from affecting, generating new form of global imbalance, which could actually generate risks for the world economy, because they are generating risk to the dynamic part of the world economy today. Again, I think this comes down to this issue of how we think globally on the regulation of capital flows. I mean, there are some views which I endorse, which said that maybe we should think more seriously about global regulation of capital flows in a better way, so as to in a sense, in the current conjuncture, allow the major advanced economies to run very expansionary monetary policies, but at the same time avoid that from generating the capital tsunami and the currency wars that are ongoing, and which actually are generating the risk of a crisis in some of the economies that are the strongest parts of the world economy today. So cross-border capital flows can also generate those risks now, and the possibility of using capital account regulations as a tool, and I would say as a tool by recipient countries, but probably by sending countries too, by countries of origin of flows. And this is, of course, quite important, because when you see the allocation of global capital or global finance, still more than 80% of global assets, financial assets, are in the industrial countries. Emerging economies and developing countries represent less than 20%. So even a minor disturbance in the industrial countries can have massive effects in relative terms on the emerging economies. So this is also a problem of the developed economies, and I think the issue should, if anything, is still being underestimated by the IMF and by all regulators. Thank you very much.
Veneroso.
Well, I've done, well, how do I put up my slides, sir? Okay. I've done two dumb things. I'm supposed to take a thyroid supplement pill in the morning, and by mistake, I took another Ambien. So I might seem a little slow. And at the same time, I put together a slide that has far too many slides, particularly for someone who's on Ambien. Now, regulation is not my thing. And I did a lot of policy work, but I'm a market guy. I'm interested in knowing what's going to happen to markets. And I think what we're all concerned about is whether or not we're going to get new bubbles. And I'm going to ask the question whether or not what the government agencies are going to do will help prevent new bubbles. And I'll let, for the most part, other people do the talking. So, sir, help. How do I turn this? Pardon me? Okay, the hope was past, present, and future state of regulation. And Elizabeth Warren has basically told us that no matter what kind of a crime you commit, we have a settlement, we charge you a fee that's much less than what you've stole, and you go home and sleep in your bed. And the rest of us, of course, we don't have such wonderful treatment. So our regulation is useless. And I think she's absolutely right. And then, okay, so here we go. All right, so, and then why are there no indictments? Because that's a way of getting to people. Tim Geithner told us that there are no indictments because they will rattle the markets. And Attorney General Holder told us also exactly the same thing. So we learn a lot from these. A very famous statement, you should be aware of it. Something you're not aware of, in 2008, when commodity prices were going up and we were ready to go into the world's deepest recession in generations, the Justice Department came out and told us that they knew all about the manipulation, the dangerous manipulation of commodity markets. And they had things on their website, and they had information from guys who must know. And if you read this, you'll know who the people are. And then they went totally quiet, and the oil price went up, and the consumer collapsed, and it had a lot to do with the severity of our recession. And they've never said anything about it, and there's never been an indictment. And this poor man at the CFTC tells us I have no money to take care of bad actors. So that's the state of regulation. Now, will we have another credit bubble? This is the Federal Reserve's area. And here's Nouriel, okay? And we're not very far away from the credit to GDP peaks of the past. And I'll leave it to, you could see it's down only a little bit. If you take household and corporate, it's only down a little bit. And it's a pretty decent high relative to indebted countries of the world. You can look at these later. This is one measure of corporate debt in the United States. The GDP keeps on rising during this period. Here's another measure that's sort of flattened out. A lot of different numbers. I don't know how to deal with these numbers. But Nouriel comes out and tells us that the Fed will respond too slowly, that we will repeat the last cycle. Basically, the Fed is held hostage by weak economy as the result of the legacy of high debt. And so therefore, we're starting to see in the low-grade corporate market a recurrence, and that they don't have the policies. And so in 2 or 3 years, there's going to be a huge credit bubble. Well, we don't need, we only need 20% of GDP to get back up to where we were at the peak. And then we will have tears. Okay. I'm interested in a stock market bubble because I think the odds of this are good. It may not happen. But what if we had that and we also had the stock market bubble of 2000 at the same time? Market cap to GDP ratio of 190%. We're already at 125%, which is 50% above the highest level we ever reached for 100 years to 1995 when the bubble era began. We're already in the zone. Okay. Keynes. Behavior. Mr. Buller told us that here's a model where people look forward. Well, Keynes, who really knew markets, I mean, this guy swung a line like Jesse Livermore. He knew that this is not the way people behaved. They cannot see the future, it is too uncertain, so therefore they must extrapolate the present and the past. Expectations are adaptive. The more liquid assets are, the more they will stick with those conventions, the more comfortable they feel with the prevailing trend, so their expectations, adaptive as they are weakly anchored, so they will change. So what is the name of the game of the stock market? The name of the stock market is to game the other guy's loosely anchored expectations. In other words, we follow trends, we have sentiments, we run markets that way, things come along and change them, we know that they can change, we try and beat the other guy to the punch. Larry Summers went and worked for a hedge fund for a year, and he found out exactly the same thing. And here's the chief economist at the World Bank, and he's a Chinese national, and they tried to create a stock market, and they found exactly the same thing. You'll find it all the time. It's the way it works. Okay, so now what are the dynamics? So high gives us some dynamics that are relevant to today's world of the Bernanke put. He too thinks uncertainty blinds us to the future, so expectations are adaptive. But he has a very different tack on this. Rather than saying people have seen people get tremendously rich from bonanza investments and they want more, he basically says if people forget about the bad periods, they will become complacent. Stability will reign. There will be tranquility. And when that happens, for any amount of money you have, your precautionary demands will fall, which means asset prices will rise. So the more you can create stability, the more you will tend to inflate asset prices. Now, he was talking about real assets financed by debt, not Keynes's world of traded assets like equities. But his famous term, stability begets instability, is all about this. And he added something to it that was, I should say this, if that basic assessment is correct and we do what the Fed hopes we will do and we grow for 2 or 3 years at 3.5% and we have low inflation, that kind of behavior will probably get us to Nouriel's debt-to-income targets based on high. But there's something else that's very important, and that is that High believed that with all of these crises, big government and the big central bank come in and they bail out. They don't want a debt deflation crisis, and everyone learns that they do this. In effect, people know there's an insurance policy out there. What this does is it reduces their sense of fear. They feel that there is an instability that will soon resume, and so therefore they're more inclined to hold less precautionary balances relative to the risk assets in their portfolio. It's some mechanism that leads them to take on more risk, both with debt and with asset prices. He's talking about real assets here. He's not talking about stocks, but we can adapt it to the stock market. We basically can say these repeated interventions will make people more inclined to speculate in stocks at high prices. That's the Bernanke put. Okay. Now, High didn't live to see this degree of moral hazard, this degree of insurance. But certainly he would have said, my God, with this, we have a higher probability of new rounds of big financial fragility. And now it's gone global. And this last guy, Kuroda, I mean, what this guy is doing, if people really think about it, okay, this absolutely blows everything off the shop, because this means you can absolutely do everything. Really, really scary stuff. And people in the stock market, they understand this. Okay, so the question is, will we have a stock market bubble in response to all the moral hazard that the central banks have created? Dudley says, I have to see a Schumpeterian event in order to be able to have a bubble. People often get excited about getting rich quick. There has to be some kind of a new internet-type invention and so forth and so on. Now, maybe that's what the Fed is looking for, but remember, High said that we don't need that. He said all we need is a lot of tranquility, and guaranteed and insured tranquility. So here are more of our Fed people saying that there's no risk, and here is the chairman himself saying there's no bubble in sight. And now he says that the Fed doesn't target asset prices, but if you read what Brian Sachs said, how the portfolio balance channel works, in fact, we are trying to get risk asset prices up. And he wants to talk about corporate bonds, but really equities are in that same basket as well. Now, there's a problem with this, and that is if you do it and you don't get a good response in the real world, but asset prices go up, you're afraid to have the asset prices go down because of the fragility of demand and output in the real world. So in effect, the point at which you would intervene to provide more QE rises with the price level of stocks. In effect, you ratchet up the Bernanke put, and it becomes a bubble machine, whether or not the Fed wants to admit it or not. Now, Nobel laureate Vernon Smith has shown that when we have big bubbles, they crash. People learn, but not that much. They try again. There's an echo bubble, 1/3 the amplitude and the duration, it crashes, then there's no bubble. And Chancellor found the same thing in history. It sort of takes care of itself. And here, we see this in the Nikkei, Japan's market. We see it in Europe, same pattern. And we see it also in Shanghai. And these are all very different situations. But the US market has now gone to a new all-time high. Now, who told us that this would happen? Lord Keynes. Lord Keynes said Americans are apt to be unduly interested in discovering what average opinion believes average opinion to be, and this national weakness finds itself in the stock market. And so there we have it. Bubble, bubble, bubble. Not bubble, bubble, fizzle. Amazing. Okay. I won't go through this. We have to go quickly. The relationship between stock prices and earnings is not particularly unusual at this point. Okay, here's David Stockman in his great tirade. And he knows a lot, that it's a great tirade, actually, saying that this whole idea of operating earnings, as opposed to reported earnings, ex write-offs, ex special items, is basically a fraud. The real earnings are the reported earnings. And so they basically fluff up the earnings, and then only later do they have to write them down. And Wall Street has been trained to look at the operating earnings, which are earnings without all the bad stuff, and not the reported earnings, which are the real earnings. And the differential is very great. And he says the Fed is misled by looking at operating earnings. And here's a survey of companies with a very interesting response telling us that, oh yes, we do manage our earnings. And this is a very interesting thing, because I should have given this to you in a chart, but my Bloomberg does not have this series from S&P of reported earnings next to operating earnings. It has operating earnings, the inflated earnings, and you can't find the reported earnings, which are the real earnings. I had 6 guys on the help desk trying to find them. Now, how many people use Bloomberg? Why am I the first guy to call up and these guys say, well, what are you talking about? That tells you something about the mentality of the market. We see that recently the operating earnings are much higher than the reported earnings, particularly in recessions when they write the bad stuff off. If you go back 15 years, the differences are much smaller. If you go back 25 years, the differences are almost non-existent. Okay, so let us look at another measure, which is the market cap to GDP. By the way, that was Robert Rubin's favorite one when he was behind the scenes with all of this. And you can see that we're already in the bubble era. Here, this was where we always traded. And believe me, the economy has not changed enough in its structure to change this. So we're still in the bubble area that they gave us back in the 1990s. And now this is the PE ratio of the reported earnings after the write-offs. Now you see, the write-offs kill the earnings. So the PE ratio goes to the moon. So what you want to do is you want to smooth that blue line. And if you smooth that blue line, so you smooth out all this game playing, you can see that maybe our PE ratio is 34 or something, and our peaks in all of our big bull markets in 1929 were more like 25. Okay, so the real earnings smooth are maybe 34 or something like this. They will tell you that they're 14. Now, this is the Schiller 10-year inflation-adjusted PE based on these same reported earnings. And you can see what the numbers are. Obviously, we're in a higher zone now. There's a regression line through here, but the regression line is regressing through the inflated period that's more recent. And now what I'm worried about is the national income and products accounts use the reported earnings, and maybe the reported earnings are inflated, and there's evidence of that. And this is very weird. We have profit to GDP higher than ever before in our history. No one knows why. We have profit margins higher than ever before in our history. No one knows why. And here's a very interesting set of numbers. We have 2 measures of the savings rate. One comes from NIPA, those national income and product accounts, and the savings rate of the household sector is a residual. Little errors in something here or there, and it all falls to the residual. And then there's a flow of funds measure of the savings rate, which is a bottom-up thing based on changes in their assets and liabilities. The flow of funds number for the savings rate is much, much higher. Wasn't back 15 years ago, but now it's much, much higher. And if you say to yourself, hey, wait a second, what if the flow of funds numbers are right? Where does it come out of? Maybe it comes out of corporate profits, which are overstated. Then you can conclude that maybe NIPA is overstating corporate profits. And so the problem was even with corporate profits. Now, there's another thing that's a Minsky-Levy thing here. I'll be done in just a minute, which is that the sum of the financial surpluses and deficits of the 4 sectors must sum to 0. So if you bring down the government deficit, the corporate profit share of GDP will tend to come down. Not 1 for 1, not necessarily, but will tend. So what happens is we've brought the fiscal deficit from 10 to 5% of GDP, and we have not brought down the profit to GDP ratio. Weird. And then if you look at Wall Street, even though we've brought down the government debt to the deficit to GDP ratio, they actually have the profits growing much faster than nominal GDP. So they're creating an even greater and greater divergence. And also in Minsky and Kalecki profits and investment tend to be the same or correlated. And in this particular case, we have extremely low net business investment and the highest profits of all, which also poses problems. And I've done a flow of funds analysis, and I said, if you take the corporate sector, what do they do with their funds? They make investments, they make cash dividends, they buy in stock. I could only come up with 7% of uses, but I got 10% of sources. And I don't know where they come from. And then, so what goes with profits? And Tobin told us that when Tobin's Q, or the market cap to GDP, goes up, companies should issue shares and make investments. And what we have found out in the bubble era is that as stock prices go up and valuations go up, they buy in more shares. That is, the net issuance becomes more negative. Just the opposite of what the rational man should do. And why is that? And it's because corporate managers have joined Keynes in his casino. Their behavior is adaptive. When equity prices rise, they expect a further rise. Then it is time to speculate and buy in your own shares. Then it is time to inflate your operating earnings. Then it is time to shower management with stock options, goose one stock, and cash in for short-term capital gains. So, what policy recommendation do I suggest? We could at least enforce financial reporting practices that keep Wall Street and corporations honest. Thank you.
Much better on ambient. He's much better on ambient.
Thank you. We've got about 20 minutes. First of all, I'll ask the panelists, would any of you like to react to anybody else's comments? Bob, you're tempted.
Yeah, I think, can't help myself. It is true that reported profits catch some of the bad stuff. The IRS reported profits that characterize NEPA do a better job of it. And the NEPA profit numbers, you're absolutely right. Profits as a share of nominal GDP right now are very high. But I don't think that's a statistical artifact. Much of what the rest of people will talk about is a frustration.
Please turn your loud on. Thank you.
Surely. Is that why you came up here before when you told me you weren't being put it on? Profits as a share of GDP are very high, but that's a frustration rather than a statistical artifact. And the fact that they are high and the NEPA profit numbers are more tin double where they were in 2000 suggests that profit the stock market ratio looks a lot less troubling than it did in 2000. In terms of corporate balance sheets, to characterize their balance sheets right now relative to where they were in 2006, there's an enormous amount of cash on hand. I would smile about that. Usually in 2006 there was very little, so I just don't see the snapshot as imminently where we were in 2008. The history is that we are backward looking, and right now it's still the case that corporations are much more circumspect today than they were from 2003 to 2008.
Let me just add something to that. I spent half a day with Landerfeld and the head of the national accounts on this. And Landerfeld told me that they scrub the reported profits in order to get them right. But it takes over 3 years to do the scrubbing. And so their first pass numbers on NIPA profits are subject to change. And in fact, if you check the 97 to 2000 period, they had to scrub the profits. They estimated down quite a bit when the big write-offs came in 2001, 2002, 2003.
Yeah, they get the IRS data with the 2-year lag.
Yeah,
so
and
they're
then it
using
takes them about
IRS
a
data
year.
with the 2-year lag, but if you look at them from 2 years ago, they're still more than double where they were in 2000. And the stock market's roughly where it was in 2000. So you've cut that ratio
I'm
in
not
half.
an expert on this by any means, but I would point out that companies seem to have done a fine job of getting their IRS profits low. And so if we're still seeing high corporate profits using IRS numbers, I'm impressed.
Yes.
Any other comments up here before we go to the audience? Any questions here for any of the members of the panel? There are microphones somewhere, I think, over here.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent panel discussion. My name is Emilios Avkoulias. I'm the professor of banking law and finance at the University of Edinburgh. About macroprudential regulation, I share your reservations, but I wonder whether we should indeed use interest rates as a tool, even though it would have been a much more effective tool. And the reason that my reservation is grounded on two reasons. A, you would hurt the rest of the economy, which does not enjoy a bubble, but in fact is in a recession. B, you will decouple price expectations, which are pegged on the inflation rate these days, and which central banks took at least 20 years to achieve. Obviously, you cannot have too much of a good thing, and price stability did cause asset bubbles. But on the other hand, it did take 20 or more years to achieve price stability. So wouldn't it be a better measure to have bubble-based leverage ratios across the economy? Not just on banks, because there is also the issue of credit flows coming from the shadow banking sector. Wouldn't leverage ratios based on excess credit flows into the economy and based on ratios that measure price to earnings to GDP be a better way, rather than just have either resort to interest rates, which would do damage in other areas, as I've said, or just stick with warnings, which would do nothing, and of course would damage central bank credibility, because the only way that the macroprudential regulator can be judged as being effective is by not showing effectiveness. The most effective way to detect a bubble is if the bubble bursts and you see the consequences. But the job of the macroprudential regulator is to prevent a bubble from bursting. So these guys will only be effective if there are no bubbles. I wonder why you think leverage, instead even of capital charges, which would help the economy in a downturn, because the counter-cyclical buffer will become a permanent capital charge. Why leverage is not being used, and when I say leverage, I mean strict leverage ratios based on credit flow trends, is not being used across the economy. What's the big problem there?
Mind if I take it first?
No, you please take it.
Yeah, there's no question that if we had Jefferson's angels who could come in and look across sectors and decide which ones were excessive and try to modulate individually, we'd do better. But we've never found Jefferson's angels. And amongst men and women that exist on the earth, I'm predisposed to the blunt instrument, simply because at least you're reflecting upon the fact that asset markets are essentially important for destabilizing dynamics, but you're trying to avoid de facto getting in the business of micromanaging the economy. And I think that's the tension at its essence that you face. Again, I said a simple way to think about that across a lot of financial services industries is say, we're not going to get into the weeds with you, but your tier one capital levels now are going to be 3 times what they used to be, so that when you screw it up, we'll still be okay.
Yeah. I don't know, there might be some room for at least some sectoral policies in macroprudential regulation. I mean, you think, for example, if authorities are convinced that there is a mortgage boom that is unsustainable, you can put a special capital charge or a special provision for lending mortgages. I mean, or if you think you think that, for instance, there is a boom in lending to local governments, you can do that. Or you can actually try to put some additional charges on certain capital market instruments. You know, I mean, it depends on, other countries have done it. I mean, that's the point. Other countries do that. I know that, you know, it's not in the tradition of the United States, but, you know, I said other countries do it. They put the specific charges on, regulatory charges, on the areas where you think there is an asset bubble.
I can only imagine what would have happened in this country in 2005 if politicians had been told, well, you know, we're going to put penalties on the housing market to bring it down. I don't think that would have sold well politically.
Well, in retrospect, it would have been good.
Yes, but if you remember what Paul Volcker did was he said, no, I'm just trying to get M1 inside these cones. And it happens that the Fed funds rate is going to 21%. That's a lot easier to sell.
Yes, over down here, please.
Hi, Paul Bennett, Fordham University. I have a question, I guess it's for Mr. Barbera, but the others can chime in. And it's really more of a, I think it's a political question. I agree with your 20% number. I mean, there's obviously some, you know, twists and turns that you could apply to it. Why is there so much resistance? Why is there so much of central bankers sort of being so satisfied with 7-8% capital, even after this tremendous crash, where 20% or something in that range, it doesn't even have to be that high, would really make a lot of these things, would really force banks to either get smaller or self-regulate more, and shareholders would demand that. There's so many reasons for it and so few reasons against it, especially if you were willing to phase it in over a few years. I'd just be
Before
interested
Bob
in your
answers,
view
let me
on
point
that.
out that those numbers are not comparable. You're 8 and you're 20. The 8 is a risk-adjusted capital number, and they risk-adjust a lot out. And Bob's 20 was an overall number. Yes.
Yes, it is. Because mortgage-backed product is AAA, and so you don't need much capital against that.
Nothing can go wrong with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is a predisposition, right, to fight the last war. Maginot Line didn't quite work out. And so what you think is you can intelligently, on a micromanaged basis, set up a financial architecture, a complex and detailed financial architecture that will prevent, and what it will do is prevent what just happened. But of course, what just happened is never what bites you in the behind in the next cycle. And that's why my predisposition would be, well, you've got this cash on hand, and you don't pretend that you're going to set up a line that will survive 10,000 lawyers trying to end run it over 5 to 10 years.
Down here, please.
Doesn't seem to be.
Two questions I'd like to ask. One, have you done a correlation, or has anybody correlated the liability side of the balance sheet with the asset side of the balance sheet? And what I mean by that is debt versus the increase in the stock market. And two, if we continue the current policy, Federal Reserve policy, because the Fed is the only game in town right now, of quantitative easing, and we don't get the economic growth beyond 2% or beyond the 1 to 2%, where are the consequences? What bubble do you foresee coming down the pike? Because if that's the case, we're going to continue to have trillion-dollar deficits going forward. How long is that going to last? And has anybody projected the consequences of that?
Well, I'm not going to answer your question directly because I don't know what it is exactly and how to answer it. But let me just say this. I'm all for the Fed's policy. If the Fed didn't do QE the way it's doing it now, particularly if we have fiscal restriction, we could run the risk of going the route of Japan. And the Japan situation is not very well explained to people. But Japan has managed to get itself through mild deflation and sustained high fiscal deficits onto a debt trap path that it's almost impossible to see how the hell you get off of it. And to do mega QE belatedly like this is dangerous beyond belief. I mean, this is really, really dangerous. If you take a look at the hyperinflation between 44 and 51 in Japan, the numbers look exactly like they look now. You shock with a belated move on QE, inflation expectations, and you can set off the same dynamics. So the Fed is doing the right thing. Just let me say that. Okay, and I'm not criticizing what they're doing. Okay.
Yeah.
What I'm worried about simply is that the Fed is not sensitive enough to the profound disequilibrium nature of markets that Mr. Keynes was so aware of. And so therefore, if we don't do something, whether it's teach people, jawbone, enforce some of our laws like Sarbanes-Oxley, if we don't do these things and we wind up with a private debt to GDP ratio that we had in 2007 and a market cap to GDP ratio that we had in 2000, and things start down because of the nature of these players, all of a sudden you'll find out that their current convention, which is we can surf the Fed, may become a different convention. It may be the Fed can't deliver on the put, and we will have one hell of a mess with no policy tools. This QE is fine, QE is right, we don't have an alternative. We just have to be aware of the risk. And the fact that the market participants are such that they can really turn on us. They don't behave the way rational models say they behave. And we can't afford that negative wealth effect, undoing 2000 and a credit crunch, undoing 2007 at the same time with no fiscal tool and no monetary tool.
Yes, sir, right here.
This is a Minsky conference, and I think what gets forgotten is that there were no Minsky moments in the 50s and 60s because the financial part of the economy was very well regulated, and the real economy needs the low interest rates. The problem isn't that low interest rates create bubbles. The problem is that low interest rates, in the absence of tough financial regulation, that then allows speculators to take advantage of the low interest rates rather than having the low interest rates go to the real economy. That's what creates bubbles. And I just want to press Bob a little bit on one point. I think it's possible to define micromanagement in such a way that it becomes a little bit of a straw man. It becomes something that's so difficult that it's unattainable. You had laws on the books in the 90s and the 2000s, including the 93 HOPA Act, which, if Alan Greenspan had bothered to enforce it, you would not have had a housing bubble. I mean, HOPA said, even if you're not otherwise regulated by the federal government, if you're a mortgage banker or a mortgage broker, you have to have prudent underwriting standards. That, enforcing that all by itself would have taken a lot of the steam out of the housing bubble, because the housing bubble wasn't a housing bubble. The housing bubble was a bubble of esoteric mortgage debt instruments that were turned into exotic securities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it isn't just monetary policy and fiscal policy, it's monetary, fiscal policy, and regulatory policy, and it's regulatory policy where everybody was captured and fell down on the job, and that's the other part of what Minsky has to teach us.
Yeah, I don't take issue with the fact that zeal for Ayn Rand and the notion that less regulation is ever and always better played a role. Absolutely right. I'm just saying that I'm amazed, peddling my own book, but literally. But I'm amazed that after this extraordinary event, we can still have the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis get up here and tell us not only is he not only worried about asset markets, but he's not worried about unemployment, and the only thing to be looking at is prices. An expanded definition of what constitutes excess on the monetary policy front, I really think would help. I should point out that Professor Kuttner, now you were first criticizing me in 1977 when I worked for Paul Tsongas, so this is sort of this is an old saw here.
We only have time for one or maybe two more questions. President, would you like to defend yourself?
I was not worried about other things. I had a very focused argument about whether you could add labor market frictions to a standard model and what you would get out of that for monetary policy. I didn't say anything about all the other factors that are critically important in thinking about.
I thought you were very
policy,
explicit.
so, okay.
You were very explicit about the fact that there were frictions in the labor market that would best be dealt with elsewhere, and that the primary focus of the central bank was wage and price excesses. That's what I thought I heard.
Yes.
And all I'm saying is
there's a big thing I didn't talk about, which would be financial stability arguments, low interest rates leading to bubbles. I've talked about that in many other contexts. It's not that I'm saying that those things aren't important, but for the purpose of this discussion, I didn't think that was worthwhile to bring in. So.
Okay, we can take one more question. Let's try this lady over here. Is there a microphone near her?
Hello. Thank you for taking my question. Isn't there a risk with macroprudential policy that the interests of the national champions and the families that are, that are the owners of those national champions in Europe, which have really done quite well over the history of the G20 agreements in the EU, and then here in the United States, the interests of the 1%, which influence macroprudential policy, which in turn the regulators have to march to, because my research on Basel III found that the FDIC failed to enforce prompt corrective action. And speaking to this gentleman's point about how we have sufficient regulatory framework on the books here in the United States, and if we kept these many protections, we wouldn't have had the problems, bubbles, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we, and perhaps this conference isn't really to address, because if you have macroprudential policy and it's influenced by the interests of a very few groups of people, and then there are companies in turn, i.e. national champions or the big American multinationals, where then is for the rest of us to enjoy, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Because we're not seeing that here in the United States. When the national champions in Europe get to have overriding power by way of G20 agreements, no net new job growth then is what the United States is supposed to march to in complying with G20. See, that affects our quality of life. I mean, so, how do we thwart, with macroprudential policy being responsive, again, to the interests of the very wealthy and those most powerful, around the world and their companies?
Well, I can tell you, I don't know what the answer is to you. All I can turn you to is the few quotes that I gave you from Justice and Elizabeth Warren and Gary Gensler, and direct you to a wonderful 60 Minutes program on why we never have indicted anyone under Sarbanes-Oxley. All I can give you is the record, which shows that if in any way we're endangering the national champions win.
Yeah, no, I have to, the notion that our regulators and our attitude right now is indistinguishable from the way it was in 2005, 2006. It just doesn't hold any water. I mean, we're in a situation now where we are in the midst of trying to aggressively re-regulate. I agree entirely that it's going ham-handed. I don't think it's particularly intelligently being done, but the notion, I went to refinance my house. I've owned the house for 27 years. I had a mortgage that was 18% of the house. My income can pay the mortgage in a year. and it took me 3.5 months. In 2006, that would have taken me 3.5 hours.
Thank you all very much.
If
And
can I add something on this? First of all, I actually think correctly that regulation here and in all advanced economies has advanced significantly over this period. I would not say macroprudential regulation has any risk of that sort that was asked for. I mean, there is actually no risk of macroprudential regulation in the U.S. for the time being, because perhaps if the Fed identifies as being a stock market boom, it should take care of that. Actually, if just to stress my point, perhaps my talk was not in the right panel, let's say. But let me say what I don't see in the U.S. is any concern about the externalities it's generating on the rest of the world, and particularly on emerging economies. And I think this should be a concern also of U.S. authorities, because U.S. authorities happen to issue the international currency. So I think the double role of the Fed as the regulator of the issue of regulator of monetary policy in the U.S., but also as the major regulator of the.
Worried about that too.
Yeah. So I think that's at the yeah.